MX Linux is a distro which is the result of a cooperative venture between the Anti-X and the MX Linux communities. It's considered a midweight distro. It's not super light, but it's also not supposed to be that bloated. And it's considered incredibly stable, and it comes with a lot of tools out of the box. It's supposed to be very good for beginners. And what actually got me interested in taking a look at this is that it is the top ranked distro on DistroWatch, at least as far as the number of ratings go. Obviously, it doesn't have the highest number rating, but out of all of the people that decided to vote on DistroWatch, MX Linux is at the top of the pile. So it makes sense to take a look at it, because if you're somebody who doesn't really know anything about Linux, you're kind of thinking of dipping your toe into the Linux pool, it's more than likely that you would go to a search engine like Google and look up what is the best Linux distro. And if you end up coming to distrowatch.com, obviously this is the one that they are recommending. So we're going to fire it up in VirtualBox and see how we feel about it. So we're going to create a new machine here. We're going to call it MX Linux. And for the type, we're just going to leave it as this generic Linux here. And we're going to go ahead and give it 4 gigs of RAM. Shouldn't really need too much, considering that it's just a midweight distro. Which in the Linux world, you got to keep in mind that midweight still means much, much lighter than Windows or even the Mac OS. We'll create the virtual hard disk, leave it as VDI, fixed size to get slightly better performance. We'll crank this up to 30 gigs. We'll create our virtual hard disk, and we'll just go into the settings and make a couple other changes. So we'll crank up our video memory. We'll do VBox VGA so that we can have full screen. We'll add 2 processors, and we'll go into our virtual CD drive here, and then we'll go ahead and insert MX Linux. There we go. And we'll go ahead and start our machine up. So right off the bat, the view is very different. It's kind of minimalist in a way, like this menu here obviously doesn't have a whole lot of graphics work put into it, but it's not truly minimalist. It's not just a boring grub screen. It's kind of in between, you know, mid-weight, as it says. And as always, the instructions here for installing, whether you're going to be doing it in a virtual machine or whether you're going to be doing it to hardware, are pretty much the same. The only real difference is obviously with hardware, you're going to be booted from a USB drive. So you would have to flash it to a USB drive first. So this is the welcome screen that we get. Again, not a whole lot of graphical work put into this. It's just a mid-weight type of look. So we'll just close out of this and go ahead and run the installer. And we'll take a look at it once it's installing. So we'll hit next. You can go ahead and do a manual partition, or you can just automatically install using the entire disk. You also have an option here to go ahead and encrypt the disk. So we typically see this with distros like Linux Mint, where we're setting them up. We just have all the GUI set up, no need to enter a bunch of commands like we would with Arch or Gentoo. So we'll go ahead and leave those as the default, and then we get another warning. Are we sure we want to format the disk? So I'm going to be using MBR since I'm just doing a regular VirtualBox installation. We'll go ahead and leave that as our system boot disk, and we'll also install Grub for Linux and Windows, even though we obviously won't be booting Windows from this virtual install here. So we have computer name, yeah, we'll leave that as MX. I'm going to change the domain to MXBox. And work group, can be work group, yeah, sure. All right, so we get one of the things that I actually kind of like about MX Linux here is with our clock, it automatically defaults to the AM PM clock. So a lot of distros these days, they give you the option when you're doing this GUI setup to choose which clock that you want. Well, some do and some don't, honestly. I can't remember whether or not Mint does. It's been a while since I've had to install it. But this is something that I do enjoy because a lot of the time they'll just default to a 24-hour clock and then you have to go change it after the fact. MX actually gives you this option during the setup, so I like that. And then you can change your service settings here. So if you don't have a printer, for example, you might want to disable cups just to make it a little bit more minimalist, not having services that you obviously can't use. Same thing with Bluetooth. A lot of people don't really use Bluetooth on their laptops or desktops. That's something that you might want to go ahead and disable. But I'm just going to leave everything as it is. All right, and then we set up our user info. So we'll make it Kenny, and set up the password. And of course, it blanks it out as all distros should. So far, the only distro I've seen that does this nonsense is Clover OS, where it actually shows your password. And then we'll set up our root password as well. And we're not going to do auto login or anything like that. So we're going to hit next. And then we just have to wait for the installation to finish. All right, and the install is finished. It was actually pretty quick. I've only had the video paused for about 2 minutes. So that's really good. Installs quickly, like most binary distros do. And we'll go ahead and do the automatic reboot. I selected VBox VGA, so we should be able to get full screen on auto reboot. If it doesn't, then obviously I'm going to have to go in and change some settings to try to get it to full screen again. We didn't get full screen during the installation, so that's a little bit disappointing. All right, so we'll go ahead and load it up. And I really like how the graphical loading screens and everything are so far. I mean, it's just, you know, it's not super fancy like you would see with KDE. This is XFCE, by the way. There is a KDE variant of MX Linux I can show you again on the browser window, but XFCE is the default one that you would download. All right, so then this is what we have. We have this startup screen that you would get, again, similar to Linux Mint, but this is very helpful with these sort of beginner distros or just really easy to use distros, right? You want to have some help that comes up so that the person knows what they want to get into. So one interesting thing about this, probably a couple of the first things that you might have noticed, is this over here. Now, if you're not familiar with what this is over here, it's called Conky, which is basically a system monitor, status monitor. And as you can see, it gives us a little bit of information, gives us the date, gives us the time, gives us some system stats here. So we have the hard disk, memory, and CPU. We can see the percentage that the hard disk is full and how much memory and CPU that we're using. So this is good. It's something that people like to look at, you know, a little bit eye candy. It might be considered a little bit outdated. I don't think that Conky is really that popular these days. I remember back around maybe 2013, 2014, I think, is when it was a little bit bigger. Everybody wanted to have Conky running on their desktop. A lot of people would consider it bloat, but again, we want to judge this distro within the context of who it's meant for, right? I mean, if you're trying to be super lean, super minimalist, this probably isn't going to be the distro for you. You'd want to stick to something like Arch, Artix, Gentoo, those sort of do-it-yourself distros. The other thing that you might have noticed is that the panel here is on the side. So this is pretty interesting. Usually I like to have my panel down at the bottom if I'm going to be using a panel, that is. I like to have it down at the bottom just because that's how Windows was, you know? My first distro, I've mentioned it a few times, that I used as a daily driver was Linux Mint. I tried Ubuntu for a bit. That's really truly the first distro I used, but I didn't really stick with it because I just didn't like the layout. Mint sort of copied the Windows layout to a bit, but didn't take any of the suck with it, and I enjoyed it. I have a few family members that use Windows, but they have it set up like this, where the bar is over on the left-hand side. And I really think that they might actually enjoy this type of setup in MX Linux. Of course, you could do this in Linux Mint, basically any other distro that has a bar, but it's something that you have to manually set up. And you know, when we have these sort of easy to use distros, we don't want the end user to have to configure too much. We want them to just be able to boot it up and go like they would with, well, not so much like they would with Windows, because obviously there's a lot of extra you'd have to do with Windows. So we have typical XFCE. So we have Thunar as our file manager, all the regular tools we would get with that. Now, one thing that I mentioned is that MX Linux is considered a very stable distro. So it's not going to be bleeding edge. Like if we look at what kernel we're running on here, we're running kernel version 4.19.09. So this is considered a stable long-term release. Okay, so this is obviously not 5.9, or I think 5.8 is one of the latest stable ones. This is the long term, so it's going to not really get a lot of updates to it besides just bug fixes and security fixes, and then it's going to be supported for a few years. Usually you would see a distro like this used in like a corporate environment where they don't necessarily need the latest and greatest. They just want things to work. And we'll see that with some of the other software that's on here. Of course, we have Python. Most Linux distros ship with Python. But we have an older version on here, 3.7.3 from last year. If we look at GCC, for example, so we're running an older version of GCC from 2018, version 8.3. But again, all of these versions of software are going to be very, very stable. So let's take a look at our task manager real quick. MX Linux ships with HTOP, which of course is my favorite task manager. So really good that they include that. And again, it's fairly lightweight. We're only using about 486 megabytes of memory, much lighter than you would see with something like Windows. We'd be using at least 2 gigs if we were on Windows. There's a little bit that I guess would be considered bloat. I mean, you've got Conky, but within the context of this particular distro, I wouldn't really consider that bloat. Of course, we have Firefox as our default web browser. Generally, we would see that in Linux distros. And let's see which version of Firefox we're running here. Okay, so it's a little bit of an older version. We're running version 7.6.0.1. Let's see if an update to that is available over in the updates. We do have 162 new updates. And let's see, yeah, so we do have the update for Firefox version 80. Now, one thing that is a bit of a downside to this distro, so you'll notice here with our updater, we don't really have a modular setup here where we can kind of pick and choose using a GUI which applications we want to update and which applications we want to hold back. This is kind of a big deal for people that are going to be a bit more pickier with their software, getting into not necessarily a power user, but sort of on their way to becoming a power user, which obviously people who are using Linux, a distro that, or a operating system rather, that actually gives you freedom to do what you want, right? GNU/Linux, you're probably going to start becoming a power user because you actually have the power to do so. So this is a real knock. You might You might not like how Firefox looks with the different address bar past, I think, version 77 is when they implemented that. So if you wanted to hold it back, it's going to be a bit tougher to do on MX Linux. So that's not a really good thing that's going on there. Let's take a look at some of the other software that we have. I want to go into, let's see, the settings manager. Okay, so we've got actually some software in here that's a little bit different. We've got Adobe Flash Player. I can't even really think what you would need Adobe Flash Player for these days. I don't think I've used Adobe Flash Player in years, so that's a little bit interesting. We have an ad block, which I want to see what this is all about. You would think that you would just have the anti-X advert blocker. Oh, okay, so it's an Etsy host. So this is going to automatically block ads in any browser that you're using. That's actually pretty useful that this is included. Yeah, I wonder if that really does work better than something like uBlock Origin. I might have to try to go to a site that's known for having a lot of ads and see if it's a little bit calmer. So this iDevice mounter is pretty interesting. So I did a little bit of research into this because I don't have any type of iDevices to use with it, so it's not something that I can actually benefit from. But when I think about this for a little bit, it's something that I bet a lot of people who are using Linux probably have no need for. Essentially, what this does is it allows you to mount an iOS file system to your Linux box. So that would be something like an iPad, an iPhone, basically any type of anything is going to run iOS. But it lets you mount it the same way that you would be able to mount an Android device or an MP3 player where you can actually browse through the file system. But the problem with iDevice Mounter is that it doesn't really work with phones that are running iOS version 5 or higher, which is pretty much every phone. I mean, I think iOS 5 came out with the iPhone 4, so if you have an iPhone 5 or newer, you're not really going to be able to mount your iDevice with this. Now, there is software that exists on Linux which will work with phones that are running newer ones. I believe iFuse is a name of them. So this iDevice mounter, I actually do consider this bloat, even within the context of this distro. Again, I wouldn't call Conky, or I wouldn't call, like there's games that come on here. I wouldn't quite consider those bloat because it at least is something that you might benefit from. You know, Conky, you get a little bit of eye candy. Games, you get, you know, games that somebody might play. But this iDevice mounter, I don't think most Linux users are really using iPhones anyway, and if they were, they certainly would not be using something as old as an iPhone 4. I don't even think Apple supports the iPhone 4, so I don't even know where you would get that. Maybe on eBay for really cheap, but again, I don't think. And let me know if you do actually have an iPhone 4 and you actually would benefit from using iDevice Mounter. Maybe there are a couple people out there. All right, so I just bookmarked a couple of sites to test the ad blocking of this with. So like we have this one here. So this is the type of, you know, article site, obviously, where we would expect to see a bunch of ads. So far, okay, there it is. So we get this pop-up ad that just comes up for both Galaxy Buds and Blue Cross Blue Shield. So we actually have ads on top of ads. Doesn't look like the ad blocker worked very good there. We could take a look at, yeah, so we have ones loading on the side. We can take a look at Forbes. They're pretty notorious for having a bunch of ads. So yeah, we got one that loaded at the top there. So I don't think that this method of ad blocking really works. Maybe it's just empty, because it was talking about Etsy host. Okay, so let's see. Let's take a look. Yeah, we don't really have anything in here. So that almost seems like it's not so much misleading, but something that someone might not necessarily understand. I mean, even I was thinking that there's ad blocking built into the system, which I guess it is, but it needs to be set up and configured. And I think that this would be more difficult for a beginner to do than just using like uBlock Origin. So that's another piece of software that I'm going to say isn't very useful, at least for someone who's going to be a beginner. So if we go into the menu here, obviously there's many more applications. So you've got all the Office stuff. LibreOffice, of course, is what they include with it. And you've got all of the different tools there. Development, you've got Genie, probably the most common IDE that they bundle with these systems. I don't know why. I guess Genie is really popular, but I've never really known anybody that actually really uses Genie as their IDE. We've got GNOME Dial-Up Tool. I don't think I've ever used that before. That's interesting. We've got Transmission as our torrenting application. We got Thunderbird as our mail client. Both really solid applications. Of course, we've got these games that come installed with it. So yeah, same kind of stuff that you would see if you were used to using Windows, right? They come with a couple little games. So overall, what do I think about AntiX? I think it's pretty good as I mean, not AntiX, MX Linux. That's the distro we're looking at. I think it's pretty good for a beginner distro, but I've got to say, I still like Linux Mint better. I could see somebody really enjoying this if they just like the panel being over to the side and if they really like Conky. But once they learn that you can just move the panel over to the side in a distro like Linux Mint, and once you can just install Conky, then I think that they would still get more benefit out of Mint. Also, you've got the Mint forums, which are very helpful if you ever get stuck on something. I've never been directed to any type of MX Linux forums for any type of issue that I've ever had on Linux. I've used Arch forums, Gentoo forums, Ubuntu, Linux Mint, never MX Linuxes. So I think that the rating that it has on DistroWatch might be a little bit higher than it should be. Maybe there's just a lot of people that are using it in corporations that are rating it because of the stability that you get. But even then, I would think that Debian would be more preferred in a corporate environment. Every corporate environment I've worked at that uses Linux, it's always been either Debian or Red Hat that we've used. We've never used something like MX Linux or even Linux Mint for that matter. Let me know in the comments down below what you think. If you've used MX Linux, what did you think about it? Do you think it's a better beginner distro than Mint? Do you think it's a better corporate distro than Debian or Red Hat? As always, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe with the notification bell on so you know when new videos are being released. Bye now.